At 35,000 feet over the Atlantic, both pilots suddenly collapsed, unconscious, unreachable, silent. 153 passengers. No one to fly the plane. The cabin erupted in panic as the announcement echoed, "We need any pilots aboard to come forward immediately." Then a quiet woman from row 22 stood up. She'd never flown a commercial jet before. But she was their only hope. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The Boeing 767 cut through the darkness at 35,000 feet, its navigation lights blinking rhythmically against the vast emptiness of the Atlantic night. Inside the cabin, most of the 153 passengers had surrendered to sleep, their seats reclined, blankets pulled up to their chins, trusting in the two pilots sitting behind the locked cockpit door to deliver them safely across the ocean to their morning destination in London. The overnight flight from Boston had been unremarkable so far: smooth air, clear weather, the kind of routine operation that commercial aviation executes thousands of times every day with mechanical precision that had become so reliable that passengers barely gave it a second thought. Sarah Chen sat in seat 22C, an aisle seat in the middle section of the economy cabin, her reading light creating a small pool of illumination in the darkened cabin. She was a woman in her early 50s with short dark hair beginning to show threads of silver, dressed in jeans and a comfortable navy sweater, appearing entirely ordinary among the mix of business travelers and tourists surrounding her. The passenger in 22B, a businessman named Michael who'd introduced himself during boarding, had made polite conversation earlier, asking if she was traveling for business or pleasure. She'd smiled and said simply, visiting family, which was true enough. She had a cousin in London, and required no elaboration that might lead to questions about her background. Michael had nodded, seeming satisfied, put in his earbuds, and that had been the extent of their interaction. He was asleep now, his head tilted against the window, snoring softly. She'd accepted the dinner service earlier with quiet thanks, choosing the chicken option over the pasta, declined the wine with a polite shake of her head, and settled in with a paperback mystery novel that she'd picked up at the airport bookstore. To anyone observing her, she was exactly what she appeared to be, a middle-aged woman on a routine transatlantic flight, unremarkable in every way, someone you'd sit next to and forget before the flight even landed. The flight attendants who'd served her dinner couldn't have suspected anything unusual about her. She'd been polite but not chatty, requested no special treatment, and given them no reason to remember her specifically among the 153 faces they were managing. What none of the passengers around her knew, what the flight attendants who'd served her dinner couldn't possibly have suspected, was that Sarah Chen had spent 23 years as one of the most accomplished test pilots in United States military aviation history. She'd flown experimental aircraft that existed only as classified projects with designation numbers rather than names, aircraft that pushed the boundaries of what was aerodynamically possible. She'd tested flight envelopes that standard aviation never approached, taken prototypes through maneuvers that would have torn apart production aircraft, and developed emergency procedures for situations that didn't exist in any textbook because they'd never been encountered before by anyone in the history of aviation. She'd landed aircraft with failed hydraulic systems, with control surfaces that had been damaged during high-G testing, with engines that had flamed out at altitudes where restart was theoretically impossible. She'd recovered from spins that according to all mathematical models should have been unrecoverable, brought home prototypes that were still figuring out whether they could actually fly according to the laws of physics as engineers understood them. She'd written technical reports that became the basis for emergency procedures now taught to fighter pilots worldwide, procedures that had saved lives in combat situations because she'd figured out solutions during test operations where the only consequence of failure was her own death. Her military record included 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses, a Legion of Merit, and commendations from 3 different Air Force Chiefs of Staff for her contributions to aviation safety and aircraft development. She'd been the first woman to test fly several classified aircraft programs, had pioneered techniques for handling fly-by-wire failures, and had mentored a generation of test pilots who now occupied senior positions throughout military aviation. Her name appeared in classified documents as the lead pilot on programs that wouldn't be publicly acknowledged for another 20 years. She'd retired from active test operations 5 years ago at the age of 47, transitioning to consulting work that kept her name out of public records and her expertise known only to a small circle of defense contractors and military aviation specialists. She preferred it that way. The attention that came with her awards and her pioneering work on next-generation fighter programs had always made her uncomfortable. She did the work because she loved flying and solving impossible problems, not for recognition or fame. The test pilot community understood this. They were all driven by the same fundamental passion for pushing boundaries and advancing aviation capability, not by desire for public acknowledgement. Anonymity suited her perfectly. She could travel without being recognized, could have normal conversations without people asking about her career, could live quietly without the burden of being treated as exceptional. She'd seen too many retired pilots struggle with civilian life because they'd become too identified with their military persona. She was determined to avoid that trap. The book in her hands was actually quite good, a well-plotted thriller involving international espionage and betrayal, and she was absorbed in a particularly tense scene when she heard the subtle change in the cabin atmosphere that made her lift her head. Years of test flying had given her an almost supernatural awareness of aircraft behavior, the kind of sensitivity that could detect problems before instruments showed them, before other pilots even sensed that something was wrong. It was a sixth sense developed through thousands of hours of flight time in aircraft that were often unstable or unpredictable, where survival depended on recognizing the earliest indicators of developing problems. Right now, something felt subtly wrong, though she couldn't immediately identify what. The engine tone was normal, the aircraft attitude was level, there was no vibration or unusual sound. But something in the pattern of the flight deck activity had changed. She'd been unconsciously tracking the rhythm of radio transmissions, the normal periodic communications between the cockpit and air traffic control that marked routine flight operations. That rhythm had stopped. Then she heard it, the barely perceptible change in engine tone, not a problem exactly, but a shift that suggested the autopilot had made a minor course correction. Normal enough in itself, aircraft made small adjustments constantly to maintain route. But that kind of correction should have been followed by a radio transmission to air traffic control informing them of the deviation and requesting amended clearance. She waited, listening with trained attention, but heard nothing. The aircraft continued its steady drone through the night, the cabin remaining dark and peaceful around her. She told herself she was being paranoid, that decades of test flying had made her hypersensitive to every minor variation. This was a commercial flight with experienced pilots, not an experimental prototype on its maiden voyage. Commercial aviation was the safest form of transportation humanity had ever developed, with redundancy built upon redundancy, with procedures refined through millions of flight hours. She returned her attention to her book, but part of her mind remained alert, monitoring the subtle cues that most passengers would never notice. 40 minutes later, Senior Flight Attendant Jennifer Martinez made her way forward through the darkened cabin toward the cockpit, carrying a tray with 2 cups of coffee and the light snacks that the pilots had requested for their scheduled crew break. It was 2:47 a.m. local time, nearly 3 hours into the 7-hour flight, and Jennifer had worked this Boston to London route enough times to know the routine perfectly. The pilots would be alert and professional, probably discussing routing or weather ahead, maybe sharing stories about their families or previous flights, maintaining the vigilant attention that kept everyone safe even during the monotonous cruise phase of flight. She pressed the intercom button outside the cockpit door and waited for the standard acknowledgement. Nothing. She pressed it again, holding it longer this time, counting 5 seconds in her head. Still no response. A small flutter of concern moved through her chest. The post-9/11 security protocols meant the cockpit door was reinforced steel, designed to withstand battering rams and even small explosive charges, locked from inside with multiple redundant mechanisms. The pilots had to unlock it from inside for anyone to enter, a security measure that had prevented hijackings but created other complications. She picked up the interphone and dialed the cockpit extension. Through the handset, she could hear it ringing in the flight deck, the distinctive sound that should have prompted immediate response. But nobody answered. The phone rang 6 times, then 7, then 8. The flutter of concern became a pulse of genuine worry. She knocked on the door, 3 sharp raps that should have been clearly audible inside even over the ambient cockpit noise. No response. Jennifer's mind raced through possibilities, each one more concerning than the last. Radio failure? No, that wouldn't prevent them from hearing the intercom or the phone or her knocking. Medical emergency? But both pilots simultaneously? That seemed almost impossible. The entire design philosophy of 2-crew operations was based on the principle that dual incapacitation was so unlikely as to be negligible. Could they both be in the bathroom? No, regulations required at least one pilot in the cockpit at all times, and besides, she would have seen one of them exit. She knocked again, harder this time, using her fist to create as much noise as possible, and called out loudly, "Captain. First officer. This is Jennifer with your crew break service. Please respond." Silence. Complete, terrifying silence from behind that reinforced door. Her hands were shaking now as she entered the emergency access code into the keypad beside the door. The system was designed with a 30-second delay to give the pilots time to override the entry if there was a security threat, if someone had obtained the code under duress or if unauthorized personnel were attempting entry. But if the pilots didn't respond, if they didn't press the override button, the door would unlock automatically after the countdown. She watched the seconds countdown on the small display, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. 20 seconds. 15. The pilots could still cancel the entry. They weren't canceling. 10 seconds. Why weren't they canceling? 5 seconds. 4. 3. 2. 1. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet cabin. Jennifer pushed the door inward and stepped onto the flight deck, and what she saw made her blood turn to ice in her veins, made her breath catch in her throat, made her mind momentarily reject what her eyes were clearly showing her. Both pilots were slumped in their seats, Captain James Morrison's head tilted forward against his chest, his chin resting on his tie, First Officer David Park leaning back with his mouth slightly open, arms hanging loosely at his sides. Neither moved. Neither reacted to the door opening or to her presence. The instrument panels glowed with their normal multicolored displays, screens showing flight parameters and navigation information, the autopilot indicator showing engaged with a steady green light, everything appearing completely normal except for the 2 unconscious men who were supposed to be flying the aircraft. Captain Morrison. Jennifer's voice came out sharp with panic, louder than she'd intended. She grabbed his shoulder and shook him hard, his body moving limply under her hands. His head lolled slightly but he didn't wake, didn't respond at all, didn't even make a sound. She moved to the first officer, shaking him with both hands, her fingers digging into his shoulders. "David. Wake up. Please wake up. David." Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Both men were breathing, she could see their chests rising and falling with regular rhythm, but they were completely unresponsive, locked in some profound unconsciousness that her urgent shaking couldn't penetrate. It was as if they'd been drugged or were in some kind of coma, their bodies present but their consciousness completely absent. Jennifer felt the world tilt around her, felt reality become something surreal and nightmarish. She was looking at an impossible situation, a nightmare scenario that wasn't supposed to be possible in modern commercial aviation. 2 pilots, specifically so that if one became incapacitated, the other could take over. Dual pilot incapacitation was the scenario that aviation authorities had consistently dismissed as too unlikely to require specific procedures. But both of them? Both unconscious simultaneously? How was that possible? She grabbed the interphone with trembling fingers, pressing the button for the back galley where she knew 2 other senior flight attendants would be preparing breakfast service. "Maria, Julie, I need you in the cockpit right now. Emergency. Drop everything and come now." Her voice cracked on the last word, betraying the terror she was trying to control. Within 90 seconds, 3 senior flight attendants were crowded onto the flight deck, and all 3 were staring in absolute horror at the unconscious pilots. Maria Rodriguez, who'd been flying for 18 years and had seen medical emergencies, turbulence injuries, and even a passenger heart attack, had never seen anything like this. Julie Thompson, newer to the job but trained in emergency medical response, immediately began checking vital signs while Maria grabbed the emergency oxygen bottle from its mount and tried to administer it to Captain Morrison, holding the mask over his face. "They're breathing," Maria said, her fingers on the captain's neck checking his pulse. "Heart rate seems normal, strong and regular. But they're completely out. I can't wake them at all." "Carbon monoxide?" Julie suggested, her voice tight with fear. "Could there be a leak in the cockpit?" "The cabin sensors would have alarmed," Jennifer said, but even as she spoke, she was looking at the environmental control system display, checking for any indication of contamination. Everything showed normal. Green lights everywhere. Cabin pressure normal. Oxygen concentration normal. Temperature normal. Could be the oxygen system. Something in their masks. Some kind of contamination. Or the cockpit air supply, Maria added, her mind racing through the emergency training she'd received. Something that affected them but not us because we're breathing cabin air that comes through different filters. They worked frantically for 5 minutes, trying everything they'd been trained to do in their emergency medical response courses. They shook the pilots with increasing aggression, administered pure oxygen from the emergency bottle, checked for obvious injuries or signs of trauma, loosened their collars and ties, called their names repeatedly in voices that grew progressively more desperate. Nothing produced even a flicker of response. Both men remained deeply, profoundly unconscious, as unreachable as if they'd been sedated for surgery. Finally, Jennifer straightened up, her face pale under the harsh cockpit lighting. "The autopilot is flying the plane right now. But if anything happens, weather, traffic conflict, system failure, we have no one to handle it. And eventually." She didn't finish the sentence, but they all knew what she meant. Eventually, the aircraft would need to descend from cruise altitude. Eventually, it would need to execute an approach. Eventually, it would need to land. And unconscious pilots couldn't execute any of those procedures. "We need to make an announcement," Maria said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Ask if there are any pilots on board. There has to be someone. Commercial pilots travel all the time." Jennifer nodded, her throat tight. She'd been a flight attendant for 14 years, had handled medical emergencies and unruly passengers and mechanical issues, but had never imagined making this kind of announcement. She picked up the PA handset, took a deep breath that did nothing to steady her racing heart, and pressed the call button. The chime that preceded announcements rang through the cabin, that familiar ding-dong sound that usually meant routine information about seatbelts or turbulence. It woke some passengers from sleep, drew the attention of others who'd been reading or watching movies. In seat 22C, Sarah Chen's head came up immediately, her body going alert in the way that years of emergency test operations had programmed into her reflexes. That chime at this hour meant something unusual, and unusual during flight operations often meant dangerous. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Senior Flight Attendant Jennifer Martinez." The woman's voice was controlled but carried an edge that made passengers sit up straighter, made conversation cease instantly, made people pull out earbuds and pause movies. "We have an unusual situation that requires immediate assistance. Both of our pilots have become incapacitated and are currently unconscious. The aircraft is flying safely on autopilot, but we urgently need anyone with pilot qualifications to identify themselves and come to the cockpit immediately. I repeat, we need any qualified pilots to make themselves known to the crew right away. This is an emergency situation." The cabin exploded with sound, gasps, exclamations, people talking over each other in rising panic. A woman 3 rows ahead of Sarah began crying, her sobs loud in the confined space. A man across the aisle was demanding to know how both pilots could be unconscious, his voice aggressive with fear. Children were asking their parents frightened questions. A teenager was frantically texting despite the no cell phone regulations. The businessman in 22B woke with a start, confused and disoriented. What's happening? Michael stammered, looking around wildly. Sarah Chen sat perfectly still, her mind already working through the implications with the cold analytical precision that test pilot training had instilled in her. Dual pilot incapacitation was extraordinarily rare, but not impossible. Contaminated oxygen supply. Pressurization failure affecting the cockpit. Food poisoning if they'd eaten something different from cabin crew. Carbon monoxide leak isolated to the flight deck. Biological agent. Chemical exposure. The cause mattered less right now than the immediate reality. A Boeing 767 with 153 people aboard was flying on autopilot with no conscious crew to manage it. Autopilot could maintain altitude, heading, and speed. It could follow a programmed route through waypoints. But it couldn't make decisions. It couldn't respond to air traffic control requests for altitude changes. It couldn't adjust for weather deviations. It couldn't handle system failures. It couldn't execute holds or diversions. And it absolutely couldn't land the aircraft, not with the kind of precision required for a safe touchdown on a runway. She could hear the announcement being repeated, could hear the growing panic in the cabin around her as people processed what they'd been told. Parents were pulling children close. People were praying. Someone was screaming. The flight attendants would be looking down the aisles, desperately hoping to see someone stand up and identify themselves as a pilot. But Sarah knew the statistics. The chances of another qualified pilot being aboard this particular flight were slim. Commercial aviation was a small world, and most pilots were either working on other flights or not traveling during their off time. The man in seat 22B had gone white, his eyes wide with terror. Did she just say both pilots are unconscious? How is that even possible? What are we going to do? Sarah didn't answer immediately. Her mind was running calculations. She had approximately 4,000 hours of flight time, accumulated over 2 decades of intensive test operations. But almost none of it was in commercial aircraft. Her experience was in military test operations, experimental fighters, prototype bombers, aircraft that barely existed yet outside of engineering drawings and wind tunnel models. She'd logged some time in trainer aircraft that had similar characteristics to commercial jets, had done some civilian flight instruction early in her career, but she'd never flown a 767 specifically. She knew the systems conceptually, knew the principles of flight that applied to any aircraft regardless of size or type, but there would be differences in procedures, in avionics interfaces, in the way this specific aircraft responded to control inputs. But she also knew something else. She might be the only person on this aircraft with any realistic chance of managing the situation until help could be arranged. Test pilot training was specifically designed for handling aircraft you'd never flown before, for figuring out systems on the fly without comprehensive manuals, for solving problems that had never been encountered previously. It was training built for the unknown, for the impossible, for situations that exceeded all normal parameters and required improvisation based on fundamental principles rather than memorized procedures. She closed her book carefully, marking her place, and stood up. The passenger in 22B looked at her in surprise, hope flickering across his terrified face. "Are you a pilot?" "Yes," Sarah said simply, her voice calm and steady, and started moving toward the front of the cabin. The cabin erupted again as people realized someone was responding to the call. Passengers were standing, leaning into the aisle to see who was walking forward, craning their necks for a view. Some were calling out questions, their voices overlapping. "Are you really a pilot? Can you fly this plane? Are we going to be okay?" Others were reaching out as if to touch her for reassurance, their hands grasping at her sleeves as she passed. Sarah kept her expression calm and confident, more for their benefit than from any feeling of confidence herself, and moved with purposeful speed, not running but not hesitating either. Jennifer Martinez saw her approaching from her position at the front of the cabin and stepped forward immediately, hope and desperation mingling in her expression. "You're a pilot." "Test pilot, retired," Sarah said quietly, keeping her voice low so nearby passengers wouldn't hear the qualification. 23 years, military aviation. I need to see the cockpit immediately. Jennifer's eyes widened slightly. Test pilot wasn't the same as commercial pilot, and she knew enough about aviation to understand the difference. But it was exponentially better than nothing, infinitely better than no pilot at all. She gestured urgently toward the cockpit door. This way. Please, quickly. They moved through the forward galley, past the curtain that separated the cabin from the working area, and Jennifer opened the cockpit door. Sarah stepped onto the flight deck and immediately began a systematic visual scan, her test pilot training taking over. Both pilots unconscious, slumped in their seats exactly as described. Primary flight display showing autopilot engaged, altitude 35,000 feet, airspeed 280 knots indicated, heading 290 degrees. Navigation display showing the aircraft tracking along its programmed route toward waypoint Natex. Fuel quantity showing approximately 43% remaining, roughly 3 hours of flight time. All engine instruments in normal range, both engines running smoothly. No warning lights, no caution messages, no master warning or caution illuminated. No obvious system failures. She moved closer to the captain's seat, checking his condition with clinical detachment. Breathing normally, chest rising and falling with regular rhythm. She pressed 2 fingers to his neck, pulse strong and regular, approximately 70 beats per minute. She lifted his eyelid carefully, pupil response normal, reactive to the light. Not hypoxic, not obviously injured, no signs of trauma. She checked the first officer with the same systematic approach and found the same results. Whatever had incapacitated them, it hadn't killed them and didn't appear to be causing immediate medical crisis beyond the unconsciousness itself. How long have they been unconscious? Sarah asked, her voice calm and professional despite the severity of the situation. We discovered them about 8 minutes ago, Jennifer replied, her voice shaking slightly. We've been trying everything to wake them, shaking them, oxygen, calling their names. They're not responding to anything we've tried. Sarah nodded, continuing her assessment. She checked the oxygen system panel, flow normal to both crew positions, no indication of contamination or system failure. She checked the cockpit environmental controls, temperature 22 degrees Celsius, pressure equivalent to 8,000 feet cabin altitude, all within normal parameters. She checked the interphone system, working properly, dial tone present. The radio stack showed the last frequency selected was Boston Center on 135.45, but the volume was turned up and there was no indication that the pilots had been responding to calls. The autopilot mode control panel showed the aircraft in LNAV and VNAV mode, following the programmed lateral and vertical navigation. She reached up and pressed the transmit button on the radio. Boston Center, this is Skybound 273 Heavy. Do you copy? The response came immediately, crackling with urgency and relief. Skybound 273, Boston Center. We've been trying to reach you for 15 minutes. Say status immediately. Boston Center, Skybound 273. Be advised both flight crew are unconscious and unresponsive. I am a passenger with military test pilot qualifications who has assumed coordination responsibility. Both pilots are breathing and stable but completely unresponsive to all revival attempts. Aircraft is stable on autopilot at flight level 350, tracking route as filed. All systems appear normal. Request immediate medical guidance and aviation support. There was a moment of dead silence on the radio, and Sarah could almost hear the collective sharp intake of breath from every controller who was listening to the frequency. Then, Skybound 273, Boston Center copies all. Stand by for emergency coordination. Be advised we are treating this as highest priority emergency. Sarah knew that right now, across the entire East Coast air traffic control system, alarm bells were going off both literally and figuratively. Every available resource was being scrambled. Medical teams would be consulted about how to revive the pilots. Aviation experts would be pulled in to provide technical support. Military coordination would be initiated to potentially shadow the aircraft with chase planes. Company operations would be alerted. The entire system would be mobilizing around this unprecedented situation of passenger pilot managing commercial aircraft with incapacitated crew. She turned to Jennifer, who was standing just inside the cockpit door with Maria and Julie, all three flight attendants looking at her with expressions mixing hope and terror. I need you to keep trying to revive the pilots using any methods the medical team suggests. Any change in their condition, even minor, eye movement, muscle twitch, change in breathing, you tell me immediately. I also need you to brief the other flight attendants. Keep the passengers as calm as possible, but they need to understand the situation is serious and everyone needs to follow crew instructions without question. No panic, but no false reassurances either. Truth with calm. Jennifer nodded, though her hands were shaking. Can you actually fly this aircraft? I mean, you said test pilot, not commercial pilot. Sarah looked at her directly, knowing that honesty was more important than false confidence. I've never flown a 767 specifically. I've never flown any commercial aircraft in actual operations. But I've flown aircraft that were far more complex and far less stable than this. I've flown prototypes that were still figuring out their flight characteristics. I can manage the systems and coordinate with ground support. The question isn't whether I can fly it, the question is whether I can land it if the pilots don't wake up. And I won't know the answer to that until we try. The honesty seemed to steady Jennifer more than false confidence would have. She nodded again, more firmly this time, and left the cockpit with the other flight attendants, pulling the door closed behind her to maintain the separation from the anxious passengers beyond. Sarah Chen settled into the first officer's seat, adjusting it for her smaller frame. At 5'6", she was shorter than most male pilots, and the seat had been configured for someone taller. She adjusted the seat height, moved it forward to reach the pedals comfortably, and adjusted the backrest angle. The Boeing 767 cockpit was more modern than some of the older trainers she'd flown early in her career, but less advanced than the latest experimental aircraft she'd tested. It was a glass cockpit with multifunction displays, electronic flight instruments, and automated systems that would have seemed like science fiction to pilots from an earlier generation, but which were now standard in modern commercial aviation. She spent the next several minutes familiarizing herself with the layout, her test pilot training telling her to understand the environment before taking any actions. Primary flight display directly in front of her showing attitude indicator, airspeed tape on the left, altitude tape on the right, heading display at the bottom. Navigation display to her right showing the flight plan route, current position, surrounding airspace. Engine instruments centrally located between the two pilot positions showing N1 and N2 readings for both engines, exhaust gas temperature, fuel flow. Autopilot mode control panel on the glare shield above the instrument panel. Radio stack between the seats with multiple navigation and communication radios. Throttle quadrant in the center pedestal with thrust levers, speed brake lever, flap lever. The radio crackled with the air traffic controller's voice. Skybound 273, Boston Center. We have Dr. Patricia Walsh from our medical team standing by with guidance on pilot revival procedures. Also establishing contact with Boeing Operations Center and Military Aviation Support Command. Please confirm your qualifications in more detail for our records. Sarah reached for the transmit button, pressing it with her left hand while her right hand rested on the control wheel, feeling the aircraft's slight movements through the autopilot. Boston Center, Skybound 273. I am Sarah Chen, retired Lieutenant Colonel, United States Air Force. 23 years as developmental test pilot with Air Force Test Center at Edwards Air Force Base. 4,000 hours total flight time. Type rated in multiple military aircraft including T-38 Talon, F-15 Eagle, F-16 Fighting Falcon, F-22 Raptor, and various experimental platforms I'm not at liberty to identify over open frequency. I have systems familiarization with commercial aircraft through academic study and simulator time, but no specific type rating in the Boeing 767. I am comfortable managing aircraft systems and can execute basic flight maneuvers, but approach and landing procedures will require verbal guidance from experienced 767 operators. Another pause, longer this time, and Sarah could imagine the controllers conferring with supervisors, aviation authorities scrambling to figure out how to handle this unprecedented situation. Then, Skybound 273, Boston Center. Understood and copied. We are locating retired 767 captains to provide real-time guidance. Military liaison confirms your service record. Stand by for medical consultation. A new voice came on the radio, female, professionally calm with the kind of steadiness that comes from years of handling medical emergencies. Colonel Chen, this is Dr. Patricia Walsh, flight surgeon with the FAA medical team. I need you to describe the pilot's condition in as much detail as possible. Respiratory rate, skin color, temperature, pupil response, any unusual odors in the cockpit, response to pain stimulus, anything that might help us diagnose the cause of unconsciousness. Sarah relayed everything she'd observed, speaking with clinical precision learned from years of writing detailed test reports. The doctor asked follow-up questions, walking her through additional checks. Sarah instructed the flight attendants through the interphone to check additional vital signs, to look for any signs of seizure activity, to smell the pilot's breath for any unusual chemical odors. After several minutes of this detailed exchange, Dr. Walsh said, Colonel Chen, based on what you're describing, this doesn't appear to be hypoxia, their oxygen saturation seems adequate. It doesn't appear to be carbon monoxide poisoning, no cherry red skin color. No obvious signs of toxic exposure to common aviation hazards. The most likely scenario based on sudden onset affecting both pilots simultaneously is some form of foodborne illness that produced toxins affecting consciousness, or potentially some chemical agent that affected both pilots but not the cabin crew, possibly because they consumed something different during their crew meal. Or potentially a very localized air quality issue, something in the cockpit ventilation system that has since cleared through normal air circulation. The good news is that their vital signs are stable. The concerning news is that we can't predict when they'll regain consciousness. Could be minutes, could be hours. Understood, Sarah replied. What revival procedures do you recommend we continue? Dr. Walsh outlined a protocol involving continued oxygen administration through the emergency bottle, periodic physical stimulation without causing injury, monitoring of vital signs every 5 minutes, and positioning to ensure airway remained clear. Sarah relayed the instructions to the flight attendants through the interphone, and they resumed their efforts with the unconscious pilots with renewed systematic approach.